The shame was a physical thing, hot and heavy in her gut. It coiled there, serpent of humiliation, as Frau von Roth's voice sliced through the opulent silence of the grand foyer. The words themselves were simple, almost banal, but her tone dipped them in venom. You are clumsy. You are stupid. You are fired. Lena kept her eyes fixed on the impossibly intricate pattern of the Persian rug beneath her feet. It was a universe of silk threads in crimson and gold, a map to a world she would never belong to. She focused on a single tight knot of blue, the exact shade of her uniform, and prayed for the floor to swallow her, whole. Her hands, clasped tight in front of her white apron, were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer force of all it took not to react, not to defend herself against the lie. The Meissen vase had not been her fault. The head butler, Herr Kessler, had bumped into her, his own mistake. But he had stood silent as a stone as Isolde. Von Roth's wrath descended upon the newest, easiest target. Did you hear me? Isolde's voice sharpened, the sound of a knife being honed. Get your things and get out of my house. I don't want to see your face again. Lena finally risked a shallow breath. The air in the Munich mansion always tasted of money and lemon polish. Today it tasted like ash. Yes, ma'am, she whispered to the floor. The shame was a blush she could feel creeping up her neck, a heat that was mortifying against her pale skin. She was 20 years old, and this was the third job she'd lost this year. None of them her fault. This one just paid better and hurt more. She dared not look at the woman who had just shattered her fragile stability. Isolde von Roth was beautiful in the way a freshly forged blade is. Beautiful, flawless, cold, and meant to draw blood. She was the wife of the man who owned this house, this street, and from what the other staff whispered in hushed tones, half the shadows in Bavaria, Viktor von Roth. The name was never spoken above a breath. He was a ghost in his own home, a whisper of power, a man whose tailored suits and silent tread were the stuff of legend among the people paid to dust his furniture and iron his shirts. Lena had only ever seen him once, a fleeting glimpse of a broad back, encased in dark gray wool, disappearing into a black Mercedes that purred like a panther. He was more concept than man, the head of a powerful, dangerous German crime syndicate, and his wife was the petty queen of his gilded cage. Lena gave a small, jerky bow, the picture of contrition. It was a performance. Inside, a bitter resignation was setting in. She would go to her small room in Dode, the staff quarters, pack her meager belongings, and be escorted out by security. The cycle would begin again. She turned, her movements stiff and small, ready to courting, make her retreat. She is going nowhere. The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to suck all the air from the cavernous foyer, leaving a vacuum in its wake. It was a voice accustomed to absolute, unquestioned obedience. Lena froze, her back to the room. The sound vibrated through the marble floor, up through the thin soles of her shoes. Slowly, she turned her head. He stood in the arched doorway of the West Wing study, a place no one but he was ever allowed to enter. He had not been there a moment ago. He moved with an appropriate, unnerving silence, a predator in his own territory. Viktor von Roth was not a concept. He was terrifyingly real. He was tall, broader at the shoulders than she had imagined. He wore a charcoal suit that was so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin, a layer of disciplined shadow. His hands were in his pockets, a casual posture that was utterly at odds with the lethal stillness radiating from him. His face was a masterpiece of cold geometry, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, eyes that were dark and unreadable. He wasn't looking at his wife. He was looking at Lena. Isolde von Roth let out a small, strangled gasp. The fury on her face curdled into something else. Something that looked almost like fear. Viktor, I didn't see you. He took a slow step into the room, then another. He moved, like the room owed him space. I am aware, he said, his voice still quiet, yet it carried the weight of thunder. His gaze did not leave Lena. It was not a lecherous look, not even a curious one. It was an assessment. He was taking inventory of her, from the fiery, slight tremble in her hands to the way she held her chin, refusing to completely bow her head. He saw everything. This girl, Isolde stammered, gesturing with a dismissive flick of her wrist. She broke the Meissen vase. She is useless. I was simply handling it. Viktor von Roth's eyes finally moved from Lena to the shattered porcelain on the Provence floor, then to the face of his head butler, Herr Kessler, who had gone pale. Herr Kessler's gaze dropped to the floor instantly, his body rigid. Viktor didn't need a confession. He read the truth in the man's terror. His dark eyes shifted back to his wife. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. You were not handling it, he stated. It was a simple correction, but it carried the force of a death sentence. You are being cruel because you are bored. It is an unattractive quality. Isolde flushed, her perfect composure cracking. How dare you speak to me? Do not, he cut her off, the words like chips of ice. Finish that sentence. Silence. Thick, heavy, suffocating silence. Even the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to be holding its breath. He walked past his wife as if she were a piece of furniture, stopping directly in front of Lena. He was so close she could smell the clean, sharp scent of his cologne, cedarwood, and something else, something like cold night air and smoke. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and she immediately regretted it. Looking into his eyes was like looking into a deep, dark well. You knew there was a bottom somewhere, but you had no desire to find it. He saw the defiance she was trying to hide, the flicker of pride she refused to extinguish. He saw the shame she felt, but he also saw that it was for her situation, not for her actions. What is your name? He asked. His voice, directed only at her, was softer now, but no less commanding. Lena, she managed, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. Lena, he repeated. He said her name differently than anyone else had. It was not a question, not a label. It was a statement. He held out a hand, palm up. It was a large hand, elegant with long fingers. A single heavy gold signet ring glinted on his pinky finger. After a beat of hesitation, she realized he wasn't offering to shake her hand. He was waiting. Confused, she glanced down. In her left hand, she was still clutching a small feather duster, the tool of her trade, the symbol of her invisibility. Her knuckles were white. Slowly, she placed the feather duster in his outstretched hand. His fingers closed around it, his grip firm, deliberate. He took the instrument of her servitude and held it for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and handed it to a stunned-looking maid who was hovering by the staircase. He looked back at Lena. Your duties have changed, he announced. Not just to her, but to the entire silent room, to his wife, to his staff. From now on, you will work for me directly. You will report to my study at 7 every morning. You are dismissed. He turned and walked back toward his study without a backward glance, the silent dismissal hanging in the air. It was for everyone but her. The other servants scurried away, melting back into the woodwork. Isolde von Roth stood frozen, her face a mask of incandescent fury and utter humiliation. Herr Kessler looked like he was about to be physically ill. Lena was left standing alone in the center of the vast foyer, the ghost of his cologne still in the air around her. The shame was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying certainty. She had just been saved from drowning, only to be claimed by the sea. The most powerful man in Munich's underworld had just made her his problem to solve, and she had no idea if that was a punishment or something infinitely more dangerous. The next morning, Lena stood outside the heavy oak doors of Viktor von Roth's study at precisely 6:59. Her old, light blue uniform had been replaced. A simple, perfectly fitted black dress and low heels had been left for her with a note from the head housekeeper that contained only 2 words, his instructions. There was no apron. She was no longer just a maid. She had no idea what she was. She knocked once, a soft, hesitant rap, enter. The same low voice from yesterday. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was even more intimidating than she had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 of the 4 walls. filled with leather-bound volumes in German and English. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and that same cedar smoke cologne. A massive mahogany desk sat before a panoramic window that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of Munich sprawling below, and behind that desk sat Viktor. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket. He was in a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing muscular, vascular arms and a glimpse of intricate black ink coiling around his left wrist. A tattoo. He was reading a document, and he didn't look up when she entered. "There is coffee on the credenza," he said, his eyes still on the page. "Black, then one for yourself. However you take it." She moved silently to the silver coffee service. Her hands were steady as she poured. It was a test. Everything was a test. He was watching her even when he wasn't. He was observing her efficiency, her nerve. She prepared his cup and placed it on his desk next to his hand without a word. Then she prepared her own, adding a splash of cream. She stood by the desk, waiting for instructions. The silence stretched. It was not an empty silence. It was heavy, weighted with unspoken power. He finally set his document down and picked up the coffee, taking a slow sip. His dark eyes watched her over the rim of the cup. "The Bauers are making a move on the Hamburg port," he said, as if she were a trusted lieutenant, and not the girl who was dusting his furniture yesterday. "They think my marriage to Isolde's family has made me weak, predictable." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This was beyond dangerous. This was a world of men, with names like Bauer and von Roth, who fought over ports and power. She was supposed to be saving money for university, not listening to the private business of a crime boss. She said nothing. Her survival instincts screamed at her to be small, to be silent, to be invisible. He seemed to find her silence interesting. A flicker of something, not quite a smile. More like a shadow of amusement touched his lips. "You do not ask questions. That is good. My wife asks too many." He gestured to a small, leather-bound book on the corner of his desk. "Your first task. I need this entire text translated into English. I need it by the end of the day." Lena looked at the book. The characters were Fraktur, the older, more complex, German script she had studied with her grandmother. It was dense, poetic. "I can do that," she said. Her voice even. He raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "You can read classic Fraktur? My grandmother taught me," she said simply. She was a poet. He stared at her for a long moment, his assessment of her visibly recalibrating. He had hired a maid. He had discovered something else entirely. "Very well," he said, turning back to his work. "Begin." For weeks, this became their routine. She would arrive, prepare the coffee, and he would give her tasks. Translating documents, organizing his personal library, researching obscure financial records. She was intelligent, and she learned quickly. He spoke to her very little, but the proximity was a constant, simmering pressure. She learned the rhythms of his day, the way he tapped his pen when he was thinking, the way his jaw tightened when he took a call from his underlings. She saw the immense, brutal, and surgically precise empire he commanded. She also saw the man who sometimes stared out the window at the city he owned with an expression of profound loneliness. The man who kept a single, pressed white gardenia, now yellowed with age, tucked inside a worn copy of a Rilke poetry anthology. It was not a flower his wife would ever favor. Isolde was all hot orchids and blood-red roses. One evening, she was working late, finishing a translation. He had left hours to go for a meeting. She was reshelving a book when her fingers brushed against another one that was slightly out of place. It was the poetry anthology. Curious, she slid it from the shelf. As she did, a small, faded photograph slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. She bent down and picked it up. It was a picture of a young woman, maybe Lena's age, with a bright, fearless smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners. She was beautiful, but in a soft, gentle way, the complete opposite of Isolde's. sharp-edged glamour. The woman in the photo was holding a single white gardenia. The study door opened. Lena's blood ran cold. Viktor stood in the doorway, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. He had returned. His eyes instantly found the photograph in her hand. Every ounce of warmth, every hint of the man she was beginning to see, vanished. The crime boss was back, and his eyes were chips of obsidian. The cold fury that radiated from him was more terrifying than any shouting could ever be. He strode toward her, his movement silent and deadly. He snatched the photo from her hand, without touching her skin. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was a low snarl. It had fallen, she stammered, taking an involuntary step back. "I was just putting the book away." He looked from the photo to her, and the pain that flashed in his eyes was so raw, so potent, it stole her breath. It was the wound he carried, the one vulnerability he kept hidden from the world. This woman was his ghost, the one he had failed to protect. He carefully, almost reverently, tucked the photograph back into the book and slid it into its place on the shelf, his back to her. "Get out," he said, his voice thick with something she couldn't name. She fled. She thought she would be fired for real this time. But the next morning, he was at his desk as usual. He did not mention the incident. The wall in between them was back, higher and colder than ever. But Lena had seen the truth. She had seen the crack in his armor. A week later, the Bowers made their move. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a message. It was a declaration of war. Lena was in the study organizing files when the world exploded. A deafening roar shattered the late afternoon quiet, and the panoramic window bowed inward, then burst into a million pieces of glittering, deadly rain. The force of the blast threw her from her feet. She landed hard on the Persian rug, her ears ringing, her mind struggling to catch up. A car bomb on their street, meant for him, through the ringing. She heard a grunt of pain. Viktor was on the floor near the Brack's desk, a large shard of glass embedded in his shoulder. Blood, dark and shocking, was already soaking through the pristine white of his shirt. Her training from a brief stint volunteering at a community clinic kicked in, competence under pressure. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sting of cuts on her own arms. Alarms were blaring throughout the mansion. Men were shouting, outside. This was her chance. Her one perfect chance to run. The front door was probably chaos. She could slip out a service exit, disappear into the city, and never look back. She could be free. She looked at him. He was trying to rise, his face pale, his jaw set in a grim line of pain. He was the monster who owned her, a man who dealt in violence, death. She owed him nothing, but she remembered the look in his eyes when he'd held that photograph, the profound grief, the failure he carried like a shroud. Instead of running toward the door, she ran toward him. She ripped a clean linen runner from the credenza and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound on his wet shoulder. "Stay still," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "You have to put pressure on it." He froze, not from her command, but from her action. He stared at her, his dark eyes wide with shock. He had expected her to run. Everyone ran. In the midst of chaos and shattering glass, with sirens wailing in the distance, he grabbed her wrist. His grip was like iron, but it wasn't meant to hurt her. It was an anchor. Their eyes locked. The air was thick with the acrid smell of explosives and the metallic tang of his blood. In that moment, he wasn't a crime, her boss, and she wasn't a maid. They were just two people on the floor of a ruined room, surrounded by danger. He saw her choice. He saw her stay, and something shifted between them, something irreparable. The invisible wall between them had been shattered along with the window. The aftermath of the bombing was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Viktor's men, a silent army in dark suits, secured the mansion with lethal efficiency. The Physicist.com, the Cyril saying, traitor was found within the hour, a guard who had been paid off by the Bowers. His fate was swift and silent. Lena didn't ask what happened to him. She didn't want to know. Viktor refused to go to a hospital. A private doctor, a man with weary eyes who asked no questions, came to the house. He stitched the wound in Viktor's shoulder right there in the study, amidst the debris. Viktor didn't flinch once. Nia stayed, handing the doctor instruments, cleaning the blood. When the doctor was finished and had discreetly left, they were alone again. The room had been partially cleaned, the broken window boarded up, but the violence of the afternoon lingered in the air. Viktor sat behind his desk, his arm in a sling beneath a fresh black shirt. He watched her as she picked up the last few pieces of shattered glass. He had not taken his eyes off her since she had chosen to help him instead of run. "You are a liability," he said. The words were cold, but his tone lacked its usual edge. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. Lena paused, a shard of glass in her hand. "I know. The Bowers will not see you as a member of my staff," he continued, his voice low. "They will see you as a weakness, a target." She met his gaze, her own steady. "I know that too." This was her second chance to leave. He was giving her an out. He could give her money, a new identity, a plane ticket to anywhere in the world. All she had to do was say the word. The sensible part of her, the part that still dreamed of a normal life, screamed at her to take it. But the part of her that had seen the man behind the monster, the part that recognized the profound loneliness in him, was silent. Leaving felt like a betrayal. It felt like running. "They will come for you," he said, his eyes searching hers, testing her. "Then they will have to get through you first," she replied. It was not a challenge. It was a statement of faith, a truth she had realized as she pressed a linen cloth to his wound. A long silence descended. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "In my world, Lena, fear is a currency. It is used to buy loyalty, to enforce respect. Everyone I know is afraid of me, of my enemies, of losing their power." He paused, and his next words were quieter, more dangerous than any threat. "You do not seem to have any." The air crackled. This was the real confession, the admission that she was different. "I'm terrified," she whispered, the most honest thing she had ever said to him, every single day. "But I'm not afraid of you." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. He stood up and walked around the desk until he stood before her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He gently took her hand, turning it over to examine the small cuts on her palm from the glass. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He traced the lines on her palm with his thumb, a gesture so intimate it made her breath catch. "This changes things," he said, his voice a low rasp. It was not a declaration of love. It was something far more potent. It was a confession of a shared fate. The Bowers did not wait long. 2 days later, they made their move, and it was directly at her. Viktor had forbidden her from leaving the mansion grounds, but the head housekeeper needed supplies from a specialty market in Schwabing. The trip was approved with 2 of Viktor's best men as her escort. It was supposed to be safe. It was not. They were ambushed in a narrow alleyway. It was fast, brutal, and professional. Her guards were good, but they were outnumbered. A black van screeched to a halt, and men poured out. Lena was shoved behind one of her guards as he fought, but she was the prize. One of the attackers broke through, grabbing her by the 7-arm, his grip like a vice. He started dragging her toward the van. She didn't scream. She fought. She drove her heel into his instep, stomped on his foot, and dug her nails into his hand. It was useless, but she refused to be taken passively. Then she heard the roar of a different engine. A black sedan, Viktor's car, flew around the corner, slamming into the side of the van with a sickening crunch of metal. The man holding her was thrown off balance. The car door burst open, and Viktor emerged. He was not the calm, controlled man from the study. This was the crime boss in his element. His face was a mask of cold, lethal rage. He moved through the violence like it was a language he was born speaking. He dispatched 2 men with a series of precise, brutal movements that were more choreography than a fight. He reached her side just as the man who held her drew a knife. Viktor didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, disarming the man and ending him with a single, final motion. He did it all right in front of her. She saw the light leave the man's eyes. One of the other attackers, wounded on the ground, began to beg for his life. Viktor's men moved to finish him, but Viktor held up a hand, stopping them. He turned and looked at Lena. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark with the aftermath of violence. It was a test, a horrific, bloody test. What would she do? Would she plead for the man's life? Would she recoil in horror? She thought of the bombing. She thought of the men who had come for her. She understood in that terrible moment that this world had its own set of brutal rules. Mercy was a weakness that would get them both killed. She held Viktor's gaze, and then she deliberately looked away from the wounded man on the ground. She gave her silent consent. She had crossed a line and she could never go back. A moment later it was over. Back in the study, the silence was absolute. Viktor was cleaning the blood from a cut on her arm with an antiseptic wipe. His movements were slow, deliberate. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a heavy, charged stillness. He finished cleaning the small wound, and his fingers lingered on her skin. He looked at her, and she saw the war inside him, the monster who had just killed without remorse, and the man who was terrified of what that monster might do to her. I told myself keeping you here was for your own safety, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I was lying to myself. It was the most honest thing he had ever said. He was not keeping her for her safety. He was keeping her for himself. The final message from the Bowers arrived the next day. It was a simple white box, delivered by a courier, who vanished before security could grab him. Viktor opened it in his study with Lena standing beside him. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a light blue maid's uniform, identical to the one she had worn on her first day. It was splattered with a Bablick beat, dark, reddish-brown stain that looked horrifically like dried blood. The message was unmistakable. We know who she was. We know what she is to you now. And we will get to her. Viktor closed the box slowly. The finality of the action was chilling. This was the end of the games. He looked not at the box, but at her. Tonight, he said, his voice cold and certain, I am going to burn the house of Bauer to the ground. He planned to lock her in the mansion's panic room, a steel-reinforced vault, hidden behind a bookshelf. He would keep her safe. He would keep her caged. But Lena was no longer just a maid. She had been watching. She had been listening. She had seen the architectural plans for the Bowers' new restaurant, their latest legitimate front, spread across his desk for a week. She had seen him tracing the ventilation shafts. And just yesterday, she had overheard one of his most trusted lieutenants, a man named Jurgen, taking a coded call. He had used a phrase, the eagle is nesting, that she had heard one of the attackers in the alley whisper into a radio just before Viktor arrived. Jurgen was the traitor. As Viktor's men prepared for war, she did not go to the panic room. She found his second in command, a grizzled older man named Kurt, who was loyal to Viktor, to a fault. Jurgen is the leak, she said, her voice low and urgent. Kurt looked at her with skepticism. How do you know this? The restaurant, she said quickly. The attack isn't planned for their family compound. It's at the new restaurant opening tonight. They're expecting you there. Jurgen is leading you into a trap. To prove she wasn't lying, she described the ventilation system from the plans in perfect detail, a piece of information only someone from Viktor's inner circle could know. Kurt's eyes widened. He knew she was telling the truth. He moved, barking orders, changing the plan, isolating Jurgen. She had not fired a gun. She had not thrown a punch. She had saved him with intelligence. She had become his asset, not his liability. Hours later, he returned. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. He was unhurt. He wore the same dark suit, immaculate as always. But she could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. The war was over. The Bowers were no longer a threat. He found her in the study, waiting by the window. She had not gone to the panic room. She had waited for him. He stopped in front of her. The silence in the room was different now. It was not tense. It was settled. Final. He did not thank her. He did not praise her. Words were insufficient for what had passed between them. Isolde is being sent to our family's estate in the Alps, he said. His voice was flat, an execution of a sentence long overdue. She will not be returning to Munich. The position is permanent. He had cleared the board. He had removed the final piece that stood between his world and her. The cost had been paid. Her old life was a ghost, a dream she could no longer remember clearly. She had seen death, and she had chosen to stay. In its shadow, he walked to the vast window, looking down at the city that was now unequivocally his. The lights of Munich glittered below them like a carpet of captured stars. He did not look at her, but he held out his hand, his palm open, at his side. It was not a command, it was not a request. It was an invitation to share the throne, to enter the cold, dangerous, and absolute world he commanded, not as a captive, but as a queen. Lena walked toward him, the nascent dawn reflecting in her eyes. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a silent, binding claim. The city was theirs, and the night was finally over.